Today we will be e-scouting a new topographic hub, but what makes these a hub for deer is really quite simple. It's a place where a lot of terrain features like ridges, secondary ridges, and drainages all come together in one place. Combine this terrain feature with water, pockets of thick cover, steep areas, relative undisturbed habitat, and food, and if a population of white-tailed deer are present, a topo hub such as the one that we're going to be studying today could be a year after year place to have multiple opportunities per year at a mature buck. I hope to show you my process for studying a new piece of hill country. This topo hub is in the area of the country where elevation changes are roughly 200 to 350 feet. Not terribly difficult, but not easy either. There are plenty of steep areas to study in this large, big wood setting. It's not West Virginia steep, but these concepts will help you figure out the more mature bucks. Steeper terrain is just harder to navigate, and the more mature bucks live here in part-time core area settings. They cross over here during the rut, and they leave buck sign. Sign should be present, and I'm going to show you where I look for verification, or else I'll find another topo hub out there that's better. I will be concentrating on the upper 1/3, so this process should work in just about any hilly or mountain terrain. I might look at bluff country a little bit differently, but that's a subject for another day. First, I like to look at the many drainages and how many ridges meet up in one spot. Where they meet will be the central part of my focus area. Next, I look at CalTopo satellite and global imagery maps and Google Earth to see what ag is close by, if any, and if private land exists and if they have any fields with ag, pasture land, etc. No matter if it's public or private land or a combination of the two, I like to look at human pressure as an element and where it's located in order to enable the decision to prep these maps. I look for reasonable distances from pressure, like homes and public access points, before putting any kind of real effort in e-scouting. Quite often, when I go to these spots, I find myself wrong. The human pressure will be evident. You'll be able to see trail cameras, snip branches, tracks, maybe a tree stand, or the area will be devoid of deer sign and particularly generational deer sign, but that's just part of the process. That's why I have many of these spots picked out prior to making the trip if it's out of state or just even 2 hours away. The time investment to e-scout does involve some risk, but that's why I love this stuff, because you never know when you're going to find a spot that produces a mature buck year after year, and the right topo hubs can be really productive. On this topo hub, there's some distant fields, there's some open areas over here to the east. They could be food plots. I'm not sure, but we need to take everything we find into consideration. I look at the tree canopy, I look at logging history. I want to know if there's any edges in this timber. And we go to Google Earth, we can look at the historical imagery and determine if the land has been logged and when, where the hardwoods are, and where the conifers might be. Concentration will be up here in the upper 1/3, and you can just kind of follow the reds and the yellows around, and those are the areas that we really want to pick apart when we get into the timber, but we can make some reasonable assumptions here just based on e-scouting. Just a basic line right down the middle of this ridge, so we can actually go two ways. So this is going to make kind of a wishbone effect, but I like to do this because it kind of helps separate east from west. And of course, we're looking for different kinds of winds. We're just going to keep following this ridge all the way out. There's a lot of drainages on this topo hub. So everything that's on the eastern facing slopes, a southwest primarily wind will be the best over here. Maybe you could get away with a west wind in some locations, and then also the dropping evening thermals will be beneficial. We won't talk about this eastern facing side here, and then everything west facing to the west here would be good for east and northeast type winds. So that's kind of what we're going to be looking at, and now we're going to zoom in and see what the map reveals, because this may take a little bit of time here. Okay, so I'm picking up this, faint LiDAR down to here. I think there's actually a county road up here to the north. It would normally show up, probably ends about right here. If the road ends, there is some LiDAR that runs down through here, so maybe this is just an old ridgetop logging road that you can still access. So I need to keep that in mind, and particularly along this ridgetop, walking this ridgetop, I would want to make sure that I check for what kind of human sign is in here, because if it's only 1 or 2 guys a year, I'm not really worried about it too much, because I'm going to hunt, the spots I think are going to be best, and they might not be hunting there. They might just be walking by here, which, it still equates to human pressure. So we just have to be mindful of what we see when we walk these logging roads. These ridgetop scrapes, that's one of the first things that you got to be looking for when you come in here. You're right at the hub of the wheel, and you're walking the tops to see if you can find that big community scrape. These flatter areas that are indicated in white here on the map are typically where I find them. If I turn on contours, you can pick them up because they're not as steep as these areas where there's a lot of lines that are close together. So I'm going to check, out here on this secondary ridge point. I'm going to check this whole secondary ridge point. This one over here, I'll check in this saddle right here. I'll check in this saddle right here. And we'll just see what we come up with. And so for today, we're going to make a few assumptions, and we're going to pick out a couple of different scrapes. And that way, if one scrape turns out to be the better of the two, maybe based on trail cam or actual time in the stand, then we'll concentrate on the better of the two scrapes, especially if we got mature buck activity on one versus the other. This is just how I go through my process. Remember, this focus area was 124.5 acres, so we got to make sure we find these scrapes that really matter. This property has a pretty decent concentration of deer. There's going to be a scrape in one of these locations, so that's why I mark them on the map during the e-scouting process. When we go in here, we actually spend the time that it takes to walk around in circles here. Over here in this saddle, we're going to go out to this ridge point. These scrapes are just reminders of where to go, but they might not be in the exact location. I'll typically just take the scrape and click on it and move it down to the right location when I get there. And then, if we search an area and there's no scrape here, I'll simply delete these off the map. I've zoomed way out on the map, and if you've watched any of my other videos, you can see why. These topo hubs and also thermal hubs are pretty easy to pick out. You can pick out parallel ridge systems when you zoom out, and you can also connect a bunch of drainages together doing this. But I've highlighted the main ridge down here in red, and just to prove a point, because when you look at these maps, things seem like they're really close when they're really not. What would your guess be at how long this line is, this red line that's this main ridge that runs down through here? And I really don't even have it going all the way, to the bottom, but it's 3.12 miles. This is big woods country, and we've already proven that it's in old standing timber with very little conifers. Most of this is mature hardwood, so we're going to want to get in here and find these thickets, and I'm going to show you how to mark the conifers on the map here in a little bit. But if we look at this main ridge again, and we concentrate on the eastern side of it for southwest or westerly winds, you might even get away with a northwest wind in certain locations, but that'll be determined by what deer sign we find in here and after we verified where the scrapes are. I've taken a few of the scrapes off of the map just to kind of declutter it a little bit, and then I've added 3 down here in this bottom. When evaluating a topo hub and it's connected to several thermal hubs, like right over here is a thermal hub, there's one right up here, there's one here, there's one down here that I've put a question mark, and we'll talk about a little bit more about that here in a minute. But I do want to walk down here to where this pasture land or these food plots are at, so that we can evaluate these thermal hubs and see if there's any scrapes down in here, and which ones are the ones that are generational type community scrapes that are here year after year no matter what. If there was a scrape here and there was little human pressure coming in from this area, and this was an active scrape, I would expect a deer to climb the ridge just on the edge of this red stuff right here. So, you know, if you just move these little points around this red stuff, it forces you to go look in these spots. That's what we want. We want to find where the more mature buck sign is located. These are just really good spots to look at. If you found a scrape down here and if you walk up this ridge and start climbing, it's likely you're going to find a trail right on the edge of this red and yellow stuff. Once you get on the trail, you can just simply turn your tracker function on, and then your tracker function can be changed later on in CalTopo from the little skinny red line that signifies it's a track by default, and you can change the track colors and things like that. But I just change them to deer trails if they become significant deer trails, and if I find a lot of rubs along through here, or at least, you know, a couple of older rubs plus some newer rubs. And the bigger the rubs, the better, at least high up. I'll just travel this deer trail just to kind of show you where I like to look. I like to look along these red and yellow areas. And sometimes I might be wrong and the trail might go up above the red and yellow, and sometimes it might go down here below the red and yellow, but it depends on the deer. We're just trying to make educated guesses that make us go to these spots. This deer might go above this trail, or this deer might go below this trail. We just got to get over here and try to figure it out. Most of the time I'm finding rubs up to here, and like I said, if I'm not finding those rubs, then I'm simply just going to delete this trail off the map and go find a new trail, because if this is a topo hub that we're going to actually hunt and spend some time in here, we need to try to figure out what's going on. So I have the trail going above this. The top is up here, right? So if we turn on our contours, you know, we're good 10, 20, 30, 40, we're good 50 feet down here below it. But there's also a bench running around through here, and you can see the bench because there's some width between the lines above the trail. The lines are going to be closer together because it's red and yellow, and then down here below the trail there's some more red and yellow stuff. You need to check a good bit below where these benches are, and then right up against the edge of the red and yellow stuff, and then on top of the red and yellow stuff. Just spend some time in here, find the trail, and follow it. A lot of times when I'm down in a spot like right here, I'll just walk up here and I'll take a quick peek. And if I see a bunch of rubs, then maybe I go back down here and I shift my focus to above the red and yellow stuff. But for the more mature bucks, it's below the steeper stuff. Coming on around through here, we're going to go across two spines of two small little secondary ridges here, and it's going to come around here and drop, you know, below the scrape. A buck would have the option to come right through this gap between the red and yellows right here. There's green in between. There's likely a trail right here, so I'm going to want to go check that out. Bigger bucks will come up here and check these scrapes, and sometimes they just come downwind of the scrape as they pass by. Let's zoom back out. Let's pick up this trail over here. Let's assume there's a good scrape down here, and when I mean a good scrape, I'm talking about bare dirt, hard, packed ground. Sometimes it's on rocks. It's been worn down so much. But if there's a 1 inch or 2 inch layer of soil that looks like it's still decomposing, I would probably ignore this scrape. Anyways, we'll take this trail up. If we zoom way in, we can see I'm off just a little bit here. This trail is gonna find the first available spot at the end of this red stuff, so that the deer can start climbing. As it starts to climb, these deer are normally going to hit the tops of these micro drainages. Here's another little micro drain that runs down through here. It'll come right around the edge of this red and yellow stuff. It might turn back and stay right on top of it, but eventually it'll come around to this other little micro drainage. And some of these micro drainages the deer can cross relatively easy, but in some circumstances they just prefer not to go down in a big dip. They'll just cross right over the top of it. I would expect the deer to either come back up high or stay down here low. There may be a trail that runs right around through here, and I'm going to want to check this out. And the trail that I have on the map may be wrong, but wherever I'm finding the big rubs, those are the ones that I'm going to keep on the map, and then zoom way back out and figure out how to hunt it. We'll zoom back out here and look at this blue one, and I colored it blue because instead of a deer coming from the scrape and immediately climbing up, maybe the thermals are super heavy that morning and a buck just decides to stay down here in the bottom. All these dropping thermals from all these ridges, the buck has an advantage until the thermals start to rise. So at some point though, he's gonna climb up and hit the tops of these drainages again, and then he might come up through the edge of this real steep stuff right where it ends. There'll likely be a trail, maybe a rub or two there, but these bucks will cross over these secondary ridges, and they'll hug that 1/3 line all the way around through here. You just got to figure out where the deer are going to cross these secondary ridges, and that's where the trail, it may come right around the steep stuff here on the bottom side and continue around between these two steep areas going this way, or the deer might turn up right here between the red and yellows where it's green and come around through here, or it might come right down through here. But our job when we're in the woods is to verify whether or not our guesses are correct, and then eliminate or adjust the lines as necessary to indicate truth, because at the end of the day we want truth on the map. I use typically Google Earth for, if you notice there's a brand new polygon here that's colored in light green and it says pines 0.34 acres. So I actually got this polygon from over on Google Earth, because if you look at the global imagery here, the picture is not all that great, so sometimes you can't distinguish. This is an aerial photograph that was taken in the summertime, so there's no winter imagery in CalTopo. You can click on global imagery or the satellite layer here, and it's not really any better. So I'll go over to Google Earth, and you notice this is where I drew it out, and it shows up with its little information box over here, and it shows up in your list of saved stuff. But we can clearly see that there's some patches of conifers here, and there's also a road here that I'm probably going to put on there, because that's going to be important, especially if you find a lot of boot tracks in it and a lot of people using it. And I want to talk more about that in a minute too, because a lot of the pressure will be on top of the ridges, and you can skirt that if you play your cards right, because the buck's not leaving. He's still going to be in the area. He might be in more thicker, steep stuff, and that's kind of where you want to be anyway. So the way we draw these polygons is you just go up here to this little tool and you add a point. So you just, with Google Earth, you just got to move this thing around. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this. And I made a mistake. Originally, I thought this was 0.34 acres, but it's actually 3.2 acres. So we'll get that changed over in CalTopo. But you just click on your new polygon here. It automatically scrolls to it down here in the bottom left-hand corner. But we're going to have to scroll back up to the top and click on these three little dots right here, and then export this as a KML file. And then we're just going to call it 1.39 acres, and we're going to save it in our Topo Hub folder here. So now we'll go back over here to CalTopo. We'll go up here to the top left. I can't show it on the screen because I don't want to give up any of the coordinates for these places, but we're going to import. We'll choose the file here. So we're going to open that and uncheck everything, and then we're just going to check the one that we want for the 1.39 acres and import it. And it's always going to default to red, so we'll just go over here, change this to this color green. We like about 40% solid line with a 2 weight, so we're good there. So now we got 2 conifer patches up here on our Topo Hub, and those are going to play an important factor, particularly if they are thick. not only for bedding but for thermal cooling on this northeast facing ridge in the summertime, all the way up into mid to late October. This year, October was very hot, 80 degrees at the end of October, but we'll see what these turn out to be when we get up there. There could be bedding for a northwest wind right over here, you know, if this is a good thick spot, but maybe not with this trail here. But right over here off to the side, yeah, that's a likely place for a bed. 2 conifer patches. We got them sent over to CalTopo as KML files, and I went ahead and drew the road over here in CalTopo. I didn't do it in Google Earth, but I did notice something that's interesting here. There is a little pond, so we're going to go find that pond over in CalTopo, and I'll draw a polygon around it because it looks like fresh water and it's up high. A deer at bed might come over here to this pond, especially on dry years, rather than going on 260 feet to the bottoms. Here to CalTopo, if we zoom in here, you can see that little pond, so I'll add a polygon to that. So now we got us a pond, and that's good news because, you know, 260 feet is not exactly 260 feet linear to get down to the bottom, so that might prove to be a good little spot to keep in mind on dry years, especially if there's a scrape here or a scrape here. The trail will be running around here on top of all this red and yellow steep stuff, and if you can find a way to get up in here with the right wind, you can actually sit here and just let your wind blow way down into here. I would verify that there wasn't any really good sign down in here first, but these ponds are pretty attractive in those years when the creek bottoms, you know, these micro drainages, when they don't have any water in them, you can score pretty big up here like that, so that's a good find. If we click on this road, it's 1.36 miles back to the blacktop where the parking lot's at. So there might be some people that come down in here. We're gonna still do our due diligence. We're gonna come down in here to this thermal hub. I measured this thermal hub with the measuring tool over here, and it is 104 feet, so it's a little over 30 yards wide, which is not ideal. These are traps for thermals and swirling winds. About the only time you can come down here and hunt is if you sneak up in here after the thermal drop has begun and just slip into a stand. But these side hills are kind of steep. Not so much over here, but these side hills are kind of steep, so you got to be really quiet. But if there's a big scrape down in here, it might be worth giving it a shot late one afternoon. Now I've switched the contour lines back on to 10 feet interval, and it's really impossible to tell which one of these scrapes is going to be the best scrape, and it's just too difficult to tell through e-scouting, but that's what boots on the ground scouting is for. Now what I like to do here is just focus on the hub of the wheel. We can start to pick out some spots that are likely good spots. Now I could spend all day long drawing all the deer trails around this upper 1/3, but I think my earlier illustration over here serves the same purpose. Just follow the yellows and the reds, and use your contour lines to determine how far you are off the top. Wind does act funny in the mountains, and so we want to make sure that we're sitting in a spot where we believe that our wind is going into a spot where the buck is not going to be at. And that includes getting down into these drainages and, you know, seeing what kind of sign. I've mentioned it a lot in my other videos, but I'll spend 4, 5, 6 hours in one of these spots just breaking it all down once. And that way I only have to go in here, you know, one time. And if I'm able to run trail cameras in here during the season, I want to get the trail camera data at a minimum October and November. This little spot right here, I like the way that this ridge is really a knife edge ridge that drops almost straight off. I would expect some bedding probably over here maybe. I would definitely be checking here for a northeast wind, here for a north wind, or really any north wind. But find where your bedding is at, because you don't want to come in here and bump him out of his bed. If you can get to this military crest right here. I like to sit on these military crests when I have a lot of steep elevation ahead of me, because if I could get a northeast wind blowing right down this edge, then it's not that many topo lines and it blows my scent way over here, and the only thing we lose is this ridge right here, potentially for a deer that's coming around here. But that's a long way across. That's 200 yards. So the other thing is it's hard to get up into some of these ditches, especially when a lot of the red is further down from the top of the ridge. It's kind of trial and error. You need to kind of come in here and just drop some milkweed, test it out when you're scouting, but it can get tricky down in here with the swirl. I would sit up here with almost any north kind of wind. I think most of you big bucks are going to be traveling this downwind edge down through here. You may be down the ridge quite a bit further than what you initially expect. It just depends on where the sign's at. I also prefer to be below or right on top of the reds and the yellows if I'm putting a tree stand in somewhere. I want my thermals to drop below that line because I don't expect a deer to cross this way. They are creatures of habit and they like that path of least resistance. So if there is a scrape down here and you can sneak in here on a late afternoon and avoid a wind swirl, with all the steep stuff coming down to here, I would expect a trail to be coming right down through here and probably going over and climbing up right here. Of course, a deer will walk this bottom. Likewise on this side, most of the bigger bucks will start to climb and just follow the reds and the yellows as they climb up. I would expect a trail coming down over here, probably not here, maybe here. So it's going to be 100 to 200 yards of searching for that big scrape. We just need to come down in here and search for it right here on this military crest. In a dry year when deer are using the pond a lot, or in any year that either of these two scrapes right here are really hot, or maybe even this scrape with a straight stick north wind blowing 180 degrees right down through here, I would want to check the tops of this really steep stuff right here. But just kind of looking at this, you can see that a deer is likely going to climb up here like this, and your wind, when he starts to climb, your wind is 200 or 300 yards down here, and it's really high up in the air. Hopefully, if you got a good steady wind over 5 miles an hour. I consider everything variable if it's less than 5 miles an hour. It's just really tough in the mountains when it's variable. But the fact that the steep stuff over here is high, so if a deer was coming up through here, I wouldn't expect that he would be able to get you. But it kind of just falls right into your lap right here. Again, you have to go down here and make sure that there's no sign down here that tells you otherwise. Setting up right here, if we zoom out, over here you got a thermal hub. So a lot of bucks are going to use this ridge right here or this ridge right here to get across from these bigger drainages. They're drainage hopping. If he does come up through here, you can even see the LiDAR that's coming right up through here. This right here is probably a spine deer trail, and the bigger bucks on these north winds, they'll hang down here along this steep stuff, come around through here, and then if there's a gap right there, he'll hit that gap. But if not, he's gonna have to come up and over around the top. So the sign down through here should tell you which way the deer are going. If they're coming down below you, they look for another spot. That spot might be right over here with a east northeast wind blowing your scent down in here to this really nasty drainage. No deer is going to want to be down in here if it doesn't have to. That's probably why that LiDAR is going up right there. The other option is to climb up here, probably stay under this steep stuff, and come right over here. So you might get away the east-northeast wind right here. Because of this thermal hub right here below it and the fact that it's wide enough, I probably would not elect to hunt over here. just because I would think that you would need an east-northeast wind, and it's just too wide. It's not steep enough. So let's move on over here to the western side of this main ridge that goes down through here, because get these southwest winds and these west winds right here, also with maybe a southerly wind just straight out of the south. Come around here. If I'm gonna hunt over here, it would be right off of one of these little edges right up here for a south-southwest wind. The way this ridge system runs, if you look down here, a south-southwest wind is going to almost come up through here like this. It will bend. Even a south-southeast wind might even bend back over this top just good enough to carry your scent right down this drainage right here. Of course, I like the way my thermals would fall down in here with a southwest setting sun, so we could sneak up into this drainage right here and climb up this hill and potentially catch some bucks coming off some of these points, that these edges that they might be bedding, and maybe come up to check the scrape out. It's on this eastern and northeastern facing slopes, south, southwest, southwest, and some westerly winds. I would probably gravitate towards an area like this where it makes a big elbow right here, and I can, catch the traffic coming right around here, and maybe something that's, with a south wind on these slopes over here, maybe checking this scrape out. Again, these scrapes depend on which scrape is the scrape, or which two scrapes are the two scrapes. It's largely dependent on this ridge here at whether this is the primary scrape down here in this thermal hub, or whether this is the primary scrape down in the thermal hub. Because what I'm trying to do is connect all these dots. If this scrape and this scrape are the two nice scrapes followed by a third, then I'm going to concentrate on this ridge right here. If this ridge comes into play, because I feel like a mature buck would want to bed in this area, particularly with these conifers in here. But I got to make sure of that. So I'm going to be checking for bedding on all these little points and right along the edges of some of the steeper stuff, not where the trails come through, but just off to these sides here. You got to spend some time looking for beds too. Because if I'm confident there's a lot of great big rubs in this general area right here, I'll probably back out and try to hunt it over here on these edges, like this stand, for example, with like a southwest wind. I could slip in potentially from access down here and climb up in here and get in an evening stand and maybe catch this buck working his way around through here. Or even, if this is the primary thermal hub, maybe the biggest rubs in the area are coming up one of these two ridges, and then I would want to place myself in one of these locations right here or right over here, just based on what the sign's telling me. Because, with a really active generational community scrape down in these thermal hubs, these ridges, these bucks are going to be dropping off all these ridges at all times of the day. So we just got to be set up and be ready and try to pick the best locations that we possibly can. Topographic hub. I hope that you're able to find a spot like this near your hunting area, and these spokes of the wheel need to be, thoroughly scouted, both e-scouting and while with boots on the ground. So if you'll get yourself in here and start walking along these areas of steep reds and yellows and the tops of these drainages and these flat spots for scrapes, and figure out which one of these scrapes is the primary community scrape, and then concentrate on, maybe multiple scrapes, but concentrate on those ridges that drop off of those scrapes, and also the ridges that are adjacent to these scrapes. And a lot of times, if you just connect these thermal hubs, determine which one of these thermal hubs is the best on one side and which one of these thermal hubs is the best on the other side. It might even be this one way down here, and then start connecting all these dots and put yourself in some of these spots that I've identified here where you have a wind advantage and a thermal advantage if possible. Sometimes that just takes trial and error, but if you can find the right spots and a topographic hub, you can enjoy success in the whitetail woods